Welcome to the deep dive. For, gosh, as long as many of us can remember, there's been this one debate, right? It echoes across comic shops, movie theaters, online forums, everywhere. Marvel versus DC. And for over 80 years, these two names, they've been like the foundational pillars of American superhero mythology. But let's be honest, that whole debate, it often just boils down to like really simple arguments. Who's stronger? Which movie made more money? Stuff like that. So today our mission is, well, to move beyond all that surface level comparison. We're going to plunge deep into the fundamental, often overlooked philosophical differences that really truly distinguish these two fictional realities. Our source material points to this core way of looking at it. DC's gods among men versus Marvel's men becoming gods. It's like this foundational schism, their core DNA, and it's dictated their wins and their losses throughout their whole history. So get ready. We're about to jump into a pretty exhaustive comparison, dissecting the pros and cons from the very early comic appearances all the way up to their pretty ambitious future plans.
You'll really see how deeply this central idea runs through everything they do.
It really is fascinating, isn't it, how just one core philosophical idea can seep into every single aspect of, well, a whole creative world. DC Comics, for instance, they really were the elder statesmen, the architect of the superhero genre itself, you could say. From the very beginning, it built this universe of, well, modern gods, these archetypal figures, immense power, unwavering morality, icons like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. They weren't just characters. They were meant to be paragons, symbols for humanity to aspire to, forged in the heat of things like the Great Depression and World War II. They were basically gods walking among us, embodying ideals. Marvel Comics, though, came along later, a competitor, really, but they found their voice, their niche, by revolutionizing that very genre. The Marvel Age of Comics, it didn't focus on these perfect godlike beings. No, it focused on flawed, fallible human beings who were thrust into godhood. Think about Spider-Man, right? The Fantastic Four, the X-Men. These guys are grounded. Their world feels like ours. They struggle with anxieties, prejudice, very human, personal problems that we can all kind of relate to. They really represent men and women aspiring to be divine, rather than gods trying to understand humanity. And this split, this foundational philosophical schism, it's not just a fun fact. It's the main lens we need to use to look at their histories, their characters, their stories, even their movies and TV shows. It explains not just what they are, but why they are, and why their paths went in such different directions.
That makes so much sense, yeah. And it really sets the stage perfectly for our first section. Let's trace this right back to the very beginning. How did these two giants, Marvel and DC, how did they even start? And what did those origins tell us right away about who they were, their core identities? Because it feels like from the jump, DC was the originator, creating the whole market.
Yeah, they really did.
While Marvel, or Timely Comics back then, was the follower, the competitor. Though, as we'll see, they were kind of destined to shake things up later on.
Absolutely. The golden age of comic books, say, roughly 1938 to 56. That was overwhelmingly defined by National Allied Publications, the company that became DC Comics. They didn't just join the market, they made the market. The debut of Superman in Action Comics, #1 in 1938. That was the big bang, the start of the whole superhero genre. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster created him, this ultimate archetype, an incredibly powerful outsider who chooses to be a symbol of truth, justice, and the American way. He was huge. Right away, an unprecedented success, sold hundreds of thousands of copies, got his own solo book super fast, and then, hot on his heels, DC brought in Batman. Detective Comics, #27, 1939, Bob Kane and Bill Finger. And Batman was the other side of that coin, right? Mortal man, driven by this deep trauma, pushing himself to the absolute peak of human potential to fight crime. So Superman and Batman together, they set up the pillars of the superhero idea, the godlike being, the perfected human, and soon you had Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern joining them, like a whole pantheon of modern deities, the big strength, the pro of DC's golden age approach. They were the architects. They built this roster of characters with just unparalleled global recognition, mythic weight. They weren't just characters, they were ideas, symbols that defined superhero for, well, generations.
Wow. So they were really creating these larger-than-life, almost mythological figures right from the start. But I guess that probably had its downsides too, maybe a bit simple.
Precisely. That strength also had a subtle weakness built in. The stories back then, often very straightforward, kind of black and white morality, Heroes were pretty much infallible, villains were just evil, end of story. And that archetypal simplicity, while super powerful and maybe necessary at the time, it started to feel a bit dated later on. Less psychologically complex compared to what Marvel would eventually bring to the table. It worked, but maybe not a lot of gray area there.
Okay, and that's where Marvel's story
Timely's story really begins as a direct response to DC blowing up right? Martin Goodman founded Timely Publications in '39 specifically to cash in on this booming comic book market DC had created. So that competitor dynamic was baked in from day one. Timely's first book, Marvel Comics #1, had some memorable characters too, like the Android Human Torch, Nomura the Submariner, and it sold really well too, almost 900,000 copies. But Timely's most iconic Golden Age creation, the one that really showed their hand, was Captain America. Captain America Comics #1, March 1941. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. And Cap was explicitly designed as this patriotic hero for a very specific moment in history, World War II. And that's a key difference from DC's myth-making, isn't it? Superman, Batman, they felt timeless. Captain America, he was a product of his time, a super soldier made to fight Nazis.
And that specificness, that topicality, was definitely a double-edged sword. The pro, immediate, powerful, real-world relevance. Cap instantly became this huge symbol of American patriotism during the war, really connected with people. But that became obvious after the war ended. Superhero popularity just plummeted. DC's mythic figures, they took a hit too, but they were strong enough, archetypal enough to survive and adapt. But Timely's heroes, being so tied to the war, they struggled to stay relevant. That led Timely to shift focus pretty dramatically. They started doing horror, westerns, other genres, and eventually rebranded as Atlas Comics in the 50s. It just shows how being too much a product of a specific time can kind of limit your shelf life.
Right. So after that initial burst, we hit the Silver Age of comic books, roughly 56 to 1970. And this is where things get really interesting, because that dynamic totally flips.
Yeah.
DC, the innovator, kind of kicks off a superhero revival.
They do.
But Marvel, the former follower, becomes the real revolutionary force. So DC's revival starts in '56 with the new Flash, Barry Allen, in Showcase #4. That's usually seen as the official start of the Silver Age. And these new DC heroes, they had more sci-fi explanations for their powers, right? Moving away from some of the Golden Age magic stuff. But bringing back heroes like the Flash immediately created this huge headache for DC's own history, didn't it?
Oh, a massive headache. The continuity problem, as they call it. I mean, what do you do with the original Golden Age Flash, Jay Garrick? And all those other heroes from the 40s? You can't just ignore them. So DC's solution was honestly ingenious for its time, and it became like the defining feature of their universe. The multiverse. In this landmark story, Flash of Two Worlds, that was the Flash, #123 in 1961, Barry Allen accidentally vibrates into another dimension and meets Jay Garrick. Boom. That established the DC multiverse. This whole cosmology where the Golden Age heroes existed on Earth 2 and the modern Silver Age heroes were on Earth 1. Now, creating the multiverse. That was a brilliant solution. A huge pro initially. It was this really elegant way to honor, preserve decades of history without being totally boxed in by it. It allowed for tons of creative freedom, legacy characters taking up old mantles, really imaginative, high-concept stories crossing dimensions. Great stuff. However, and this is where it became a major con, this solution eventually became one of DC's biggest liabilities. Over the decades, the multiverse just grew and grew into this. Well, convoluted mess is the only way to put it. An impenetrable web of parallel Earths that just completely confused new readers. And as we'll get into later, it forced them into these periodic, universe-shattering crisis events just to try and streamline things and hit the reset button. A brilliant idea that kind of spun out of control.
Wow. Okay, so as DC is building this sprawling, maybe slightly unwieldy multiverse, Marvel Comics, the company formerly known as Atlas, is gearing up for its own kind of revolution. In 1961, Goodman tells Stan Lee, hey, DC's Justice League is doing great, make it a team. And the result, from Lee and artist Jack Kirby, is the Fantastic Four #1. And what that comic really did, it wasn't just introducing a team, it launched a whole new cohesive universe, and more importantly, a completely new philosophy of how to tell superhero stories.
It was a total game changer. Yeah, this Marvel Age was defined by its heroes with feet of clay. The Fantastic Four, for example. They were basically a dysfunctional family. They argued, they held grudges, they had egos, all while saving the world. Spider-Man, created by Lee and Steve Ditko. He was this awkward teenager, plagued by self-doubt, couldn't talk to girls, always worried about money. The Hulk was this tragic monster, hunted and misunderstood. The X-Men, feared and hated by the very people they were trying to protect. These were profoundly flawed, relatable characters, living in a world that felt real, mostly gritty, 1960s New York City. And this approach, massive pro, it created this immediate, powerful connection with an older, maybe more cynical readership, especially in college campuses. They love this stuff. The single, interconnected universe, they called it, the world outside your window. It fostered this powerful sense of realism. Crossovers, guest spots, they felt totally organic, important. Now, if you had to find a con, maybe the initial focus on just one city and the grounded reality could sometimes feel a little less epic in scope compared to DC's dimension-hopping, universe-saving epics. But that's a minor quibble against a strategy that just fundamentally changed the game.
So the Silver Age really locked in these fundamental opposing ways of building worlds. DC's universe, born out of needing to manage this existing history, became this anthology of different worlds and eras, held together by the complex but elegant multiverse concept.
Right.
Whereas Marvel's universe, starting almost fresh, was built from the ground up as one single serialized story. It sounds like this philosophical split became the single most important difference between them, shaping their creative choices, their successes, their failures for the next 60 years.
Absolutely. And those creative philosophies, they were in turn deeply shaped by their very different corporate histories. These aren't just boring business details. They actually caused a lot of their modern creative paths and commercial strategies, especially when we start talking about movies and TV shows.
That's a really interesting point. So how did DC's corporate journey influence its creative output? Being under one big roof for so long.
Yeah, DC Comics has spent most of its life under the umbrella of one huge media conglomerate. Kinney National Company bought them back in '67, which eventually became Warner Communications, and now, the giant Warner Bros. Discovery. This long-term, relatively stable ownership, it had sort of a double-edged effect. A major pro was that this structure often allowed for a surprising amount of creative freedom within different divisions. DC Comics, the publishing arm, was able to nurture these really prestigious, creator-driven projects that often stood outside the main superhero universe continuity. That environment led to things like the Vertigo imprint in '93, which published huge literary works like Neil Gaiman's The Sandman, Alan Moore's amazing run on Swamp Thing. These books really pushed comics into new territory, earning artistic and literary respect. And that happened because the corporate structure didn't demand absolute synergy between, say, comics and movies back then. But the con of that same model was, multimedia chaos. The same silos that allowed for publishing prestige. They led to this fractured landscape on screen, multiple disconnected adaptations all running at the same time. You had the critically beloved DC animated universe of DCEU in the 90s and 2000s, totally separate from the often struggling live-action movies. It just diluted the brand identity, confused audiences. You had the Arrowverse on TV, the DCEU movies, then standalone stuff like the Batman and Joker, all operating in different realities. It was a narrative mess, really. No single vision.
And Marvel's journey was way more bumpy, wasn't it? I remember hearing about bankruptcy.
Oh, bumpy is putting it mildly, yeah. After a bunch of ownership changes in the 80s, Marvel went public in '91, then bam, Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1996. Market crash, some questionable management. It was bad. But that near-death experience, it basically forged their entire future strategy. A major pro, weirdly born out of desperation, was that Marvel had to license its film rights out to different studios in the 90s. So you got Fox making X-Men in 2000, Sony making Spider-Man in 2002. Those movies were huge hits. They proved superhero movies could work big time. And they basically, inadvertently, created the very market that Marvel itself would later come to dominate. Kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, that's wild.
So after they crawled out of bankruptcy, got some rights back, Marvel did something bold. They formed their own film studio, Marvel Studios. Central creative control, one vision. Then the absolute game changer. Disney bought Marvel Entertainment in 2009 for $4 billion. That gave them the huge capital and, importantly, the synergistic corporate structure they needed to pull off the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the MCU. Now, the con of this incredibly successful model, that intense focus on synergy can sometimes feel like it's putting creative constraints on things. The comics division, some argue, feels a bit like an IP farm for the movies, which make way more money. Comic storylines, character redesigns sometimes seem like they're being tailored to match the movies, which could stifle the kind of wild, standalone, creator-driven stuff that, ironically, DC sometimes allowed.
So, wow. Corporate structure really did shape their creative destinies. DC's stability, but also its silos, led to literary highs in comics, but chaos on screen. Marvel's chaotic journey through bankruptcy to the Disney machine led to incredible commercial success and brand unity, but maybe sometimes at the expense of creative risk-taking.
Yeah.
It's a really fascinating trade-off. Okay, let's shift gears now. How did they actually manage the fabric of their universes, the continuity? For decades, Marvel and DC have wrestled with this paradox. How do you tell endless stories but keep it all making sense, keep it welcoming for new people? And their answers are these two really distinct and maybe deeply flawed ways of doing it. The sliding timescale versus the constant reboot.
Right. At the heart of Marvel's whole continuity thing is what they call the sliding timescale. It's basically an editorial rule where time inside the Marvel Universe moves way, way slower than our time. There's no official ratio, but the general idea is maybe for every 4 or 5 years that pass for us, only about 1 year passes for the characters. This lets the Marvel Age of comics, which kicked off with the Fantastic Four back in '61, have happened only maybe 15 years ago in current stories. Think about that. Characters introduced over 60 years ago are still like in their late 20s or early 30s in the comics. The main pro here, it preserves their big characters, Peter Parker, Scott Summers, they stay eternally 28, right? They don't age out, retire, they stay relevant for new generations. And it creates this illusion of one single unbroken history going all the way back. Theoretically, it's all canon, but the con of the sliding timescale, it creates these huge logical problems, chronological absurdities. Characters whose origins are tied to specific historical moments become impossible. Tony Stark's origin used to be Vietnam. Now it's been retconned over and over to more recent conflicts to keep him young. Same issue for the Punisher. And then you get guys like Captain America, a World War II soldier, or Magneto, a Holocaust survivor. How are they still around and active? You need these extraordinary explanations, suspended animation for Cap, de-aging tech, or weird healing factors for Magneto. This constant patching of the timeline, it really strains belief, creates this super complex web of retcons that's almost as confusing as the thing it's trying to simplify. It's like patching a leaky boat with more and more elaborate but temporary fixes.
Okay, so Marvel goes for character consistency, but logic kind of takes a back seat sometimes. And DC, they've historically used a much more aggressive tool for managing their timeline. Just hit the reset button, don't they?
They absolutely do. DC has embraced the universe-wide hard reboot. Starting with that huge 1985 series, Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC basically set up the cycle. Every decade or so, a big event designed to clear away all the tangled history. This kept happening. 0 Hour in '94, Infinite Crisis in 2005, and maybe the most famous or infamous Flashpoint in 2011. That led to the New 52 relaunch, wiped the slate clean, rebooted every single comic back to issue #1, everything, back to square one. The pro, or at least the intended goal of this cycle, to give new readers a clean slate, an easy entry point. Wipe away the past, modernize characters, ditch the baggage, present a fresh universe, and sometimes it worked. These reboots often led to really bold, acclaimed new takes on heroes, like John Byrne's Man of Steel or George Perez's Wonder Woman after the first Crisis. But the con, oh boy, the con is huge, multifaceted. These reboots constantly alienate and infuriate long-term fans. People who've invested time, money, emotion into decades of stories suddenly see it all declared irrelevant, null and void. And worse, the reboots often spectacularly fail at simplifying things. After the first Crisis, trying to merge multiple Earths into one created these impossible continuity knots. Hawkman became the poster child for this. His contradictory origins, Egyptian prince and alien space cop, became this running joke. Power Girl, who was Earth 2 Supergirl, how does she even exist if there's only one Krypton now? It just shows Marvel prioritizes character consistency even if it defies logic. DC prioritizes accessibility, even if it means blowing up narrative stability and ticking off fans. Neither system is perfect. They're just two different philosophical answers to this impossible problem of telling infinite stories. And if you look at the big events crisis, Flashpoint, Move 52 for DC, they're all about universe-altering continuity changes. Marvel's big events, Heroes Reborn, House of M, Secret Wars, they change the status quo, sure, but usually within that existing sliding timeline. Very different goals.
It's really fascinating that both publishers end up using the multiverse concept, but for totally different reasons and with different structures. It's not just that they have one, but why it exists that's so revealing.
Exactly. For DC, the multiverse isn't just a plot device, it's like foundational, a philosophical cosmology almost, established back in the Silver Age, right? Parallel universes, different Earths, all vibrating at different frequencies in the same space. And it's not random, there are rules. Cosmic laws, cosmic beings. The Speed Force acts like a barrier between worlds, only speedsters can cross it easily. The space between universes, the bleed, is patrolled by these cosmic dudes called monitors. And it's evolved over time, especially with writers like Grant Morrison. It became this complex map, 52 known universes in the local multiverse, a dark multiverse of failed worlds, an antimatter universe, even hints of a bigger omniverse containing multiple multiverses. Very structured, almost scientific. The huge pro of this approach, immense creative diversity. The DC multiverse is where legacy lives. Golden Age Jay Garrick and Silver Age Barry Allen can team up. It's a place to explore morality through dark mirrors like Earth 3's evil crime syndicate. And most importantly, it's the home of Elseworlds. These amazing standalone stories like Kingdom Come or Superman. Edwardson that can explore cool ideas without messing with the main continuity. They really enrich the whole mythology. The con, though, it's just so complex for a casual reader. The orrery of worlds worlds map, the source wall, all the different crises, it can be totally daunting, impenetrable, makes the universe feel really inaccessible unless you're willing to do homework. It can feel like a system only hardcore fans truly get.
Okay, so DC's is this sophisticated, almost academic structure. How does Marvel's multiverse stack up? Is it deeply woven into their core philosophy?
Marvel's is quite different. It grew much more organically. Historically, it just wasn't as central, not as much of a core thematic thing. It popped up more from individual stories, exploring alternate timelines, like Days of Future Past or those What If comics, and distinct publishing lines that were later just sort of designated as separate universes. The Ultimate Universe, the 2099 Future, the 90s cartoon universe, they were created as their own things first. The multiverse concept for Marvel was often just a way to categorize these already existing alternate stories, not a pre-planned structure they fit into. It felt more practical, less philosophical, at least initially. The pro of doing it this way: historically, it was way more accessible. The idea of an alternate timeline caused by changing the past. That's pretty intuitive for most people, more so than vibrational frequencies maybe. And it let Marvel run really successful, long-running alternate universes like the Ultimate line gave new readers a fresh start without rebooting their main Earth 616 continuity. The con? Well, sometimes it lacked the thematic depth or the legacy potential of DC's version. For a long time, the Marvel multiverse felt more like a plot device. A way to facilitate crossovers like Spider-Verse or bring in evil versions of heroes for a fight. Less of a core philosophical component. It's really only very recently, with the MCU pushing the multiverse saga, that Marvel started treating the multiverse as the central story engine, adopting a much more DC-like approach, funnily enough. Quite a shift for them.
And it's not just about the characters or the timelines, right? It's about where these stories happen. The settings themselves are crucial, and again, their fundamental differences really pop. It totally affects the mood and feel of the universe.
Oh, completely. DC's use of iconic fictional cities, Metropolis, Gotham City, Central City, Coast City, Star City, that's a cornerstone of their world building. These places aren't just backdrops, they're practically characters themselves, distinct architecture, unique atmospheres, their own mythologies. The pro of doing this, it creates these powerful, self-contained worlds for each hero, Gotham's dark, gothic horror vibe. It's inseparable from Batman's psyche. It's this oppressive, crime-ridden place that mirrors his soul. Metropolis. Bright, Art Deco, City of Tomorrow optimism. Perfect reflection of Superman's hopeful nature. This allows for really deep, tonally unique storytelling that defines the character's whole world. The con, though, it can make the shared DC universe feel kind of disjointed, less cohesive. The stark tonal and geographic separation raises those nagging logical questions fans love to debate, like the big one. Why doesn't Superman just fly over and clean up Gotham in 5 minutes? And yeah, they've offered explanations over the years, but that separation can make the world feel less like one interconnected planet and more like a collection of city-states. Which makes sense, maybe, given that the characters were created individually first, then sort of smashed together later.
Right, so DC has these iconic, almost mythical cities. But Marvel took the complete opposite path, didn't they? Grounding their heroes in the real world.
Exactly. Marvel, right from the start of the Marvel Age in '61, grounded its stories in real-world locations. And New York City became the undeniable epicenter, the pro of that strategy. It powerfully boosts that world outside your window feeling, makes the Fantastic seem more relatable, more immediate. Seeing Spidey swing past the Empire State Building or knowing the Fantastic Four's Baxter Building is right there in Midtown Manhattan, it reinforces that these characters all share the same space, makes their interactions with the whole idea of a single universe feel much more natural, more believable. The con of this real-world geography, you risk narrative congestion, and maybe a lack of unique environmental storytelling. Relying so heavily on NYC can make the Marvel Universe feel geographically tiny sometimes. Yeah, they have fictional countries like Latveria and Wakanda, but the day-to-day action, overwhelmingly concentrated in one city, which strains belief in a different way. How can one city possibly handle so many heroes, so many villains, so many world-ending catastrophes without just collapsing? It requires a different kind of suspension of disbelief from the reader.
Okay, so what does all this mean for the soul of a comic book universe? It really comes down to the characters, doesn't it? And their archetypes are built with these fundamentally different narrative and philosophical goals. It's truly a study in contrasts, especially when you look at the big guns, the paragons of each universe.
Absolutely. At the moral center of both universes, you've got this paragon of virtue, right? A figure of just unwavering goodness. Yet, Superman and Captain America, people compare them all the time, but they represent two really distinct facets of that heroic ideal. Superman is the ultimate immigrant story. He's an alien, an outsider from a dead planet. He has the power of a god, literally, but he was raised with these humble, small-town values from Kansas. His core struggle isn't about physical weakness. It's about the huge responsibility of using that power wisely, with restraint. He chooses to embody the best of humanity. He's an aspirational symbol for the whole world, kind of messianic, representing hope and kindness. The pro of Superman's archetype. That universal, almost religious symbolism. He's a beacon for everyone. The con. His near invulnerability, his immense power, can sometimes make him hard for readers to relate to personally. He's maybe more of a god to be admired than a man to be understood. You look up to him, but maybe you don't see yourself in him.
And Captain America.
Yeah.
How does his archetype stack up against Superman's almost divine nature? Is he more human?
Captain America, yeah, he's the total opposite in origin. He's the ultimate embodiment of human potential. He's not an immigrant, he's a native. A frail kid from Brooklyn who, through science and just pure willpower, was made strong. His power isn't godlike, it's peak human achievement. His central conflict often comes from being a man out of time, a soldier from this more morally black and white era, World War II, who has to stick to his unwavering ethical code in our complex, cynical, modern world. He fights not for the government necessarily, but for the ideal of America: liberty, justice, individual dignity. The pro of Cap's archetype. His grounded, human-level struggle. He's a leader of men, not a god looking down. His moral stands, like in Civil War, feel deeply personal, relatable. The con, that explicit patriotic symbolism. While powerful, it can be complex, maybe even alienating in a global context. It ties him to a specific national identity in a way the alien Superman just transcends. One is universally aspirational. The other, while noble, carries a very specific flag.
Moving to another really fascinating pairing, these non-superpowered billionaires. Batman and Iron Man. They seem similar on the surface, rich guys, gadgets, but their motivations, their methods couldn't be more different.
Oh, absolutely, worlds apart. Batman is forged by trauma, that horrific murder of his parents. It drove Bruce Wayne to this singular obsessive mission, impose order on the chaos that wrecked his life. His methods, rooted in fear, intimidation, perfecting the human body and mind. He's a master detective, strategist, martial artist. He operates from the shadows, embraces the darkness to fight it. The pro of Batman, his incredible psychological complexity, the rich, noir atmosphere of Gotham City that surrounds him. It makes him one of the most compelling, iconic characters in all of fiction, period. The con, that grimness. In lesser hands, it can become like a one-note parody, and his strict no-kill rule, while totally central to who he is, can sometimes strain belief when he's up against mass murderers like the Joker. But it creates this amazing moral tension, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And then you've got Iron Man, who seems to just revel in the spotlight, the complete opposite of Batman hiding in the shadows.
That's a perfect way to put it. Iron Man is forged by ego and then redemption. Tony Stark starts as this self-absorbed weapons maker. Then this life-altering traumatic event forces him to confront his legacy, what he's put out into the world. His heroism isn't about imposing order on the past. It's about building a better future through technology. His methods, innovation, overwhelming firepower, and yeah, a very public persona. He's a futurist, an engineer, operating right in the bright spotlight of celebrity. The pro of Iron Man, his journey, his evolution. He's a deeply flawed guy who actually grows and changes, which makes him one of Marvel's most relatable heroes, despite the billions. And his armor, always upgrading. Endless visual and story possibilities. The con, sometimes the character gets overshadowed by the tech. The focus drifts from the man inside the suit to just the cool spectacle of the suit itself. It's that constant balancing act.
And their premier super teams. They reflect the same philosophical split we keep coming back to. The Justice League versus the Avengers. It's almost like the very idea of the team is different.
Exactly. The Justice League. It's basically a pantheon. The core roster is usually DC's heaviest hitters, that iconic Trinity, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, plus other top-tier heroes. They're peers. Immense power. They usually assemble reactively when some world-ending cosmic threat shows up that no single hero can handle. Their dynamic is mostly mutual respect among equals, like modern-day gods getting together. The narrative function of the League is often just to show how huge the threat is, and maybe serve as a way to cross-promote, boost the profile of lesser-known heroes by putting them next to the big icons. The pro of this concept, the epic mythic scale. A Justice League story just feels huge, monumental, like the gods themselves have come down to save us. The con, though, that huge power imbalance between members, Superman versus, say, Green Arrow. It can sideline the less powerful heroes, make them feel irrelevant. And the focus on these massive external threats often leaves less room for the personal, character-driven conflict that really defines their rivals. They're often defined more by the problem they face than by their own internal struggles.
Okay, and what about the Avengers? If the Justice League is the pantheon, What's the Avengers' defining thing? More like colleagues.
Colleagues, soldiers, misfits, maybe a found family is the best way to put it. The Avengers are different. Their formation is often just circumstance or even a government order. Their roster, famously fluid, mixing powerhouses like Thor and Captain Marvel with street-level folks like Hawkeye and Black Widow. They're a much more proactive team usually, but their defining characteristic, internal conflict. They are a flawed, bickering, deeply human found family, constantly struggling with ego clashes, ideological arguments, personal drama. The pro of the Avengers, that relatable human dynamic. Their stories are just as much about the fights between them as they are about the bad guy. That creates incredibly compelling drama. You care about them not just as heroes, but as, people messing up and trying again. The con, if you want to call it that. Their constant infighting can sometimes make you wonder how they ever get anything done. It can undermine their credibility as Earth's mightiest heroes, make them seem almost dysfunctional to the point of incompetence sometimes. It's hard to imagine the Justice League having a massive brawl over leadership, but for the Avengers, that's practically a Tuesday.
Huh. Right. And of course, a hero is often defined by their villains. And how Marvel and DC handle their antagonists. It's another direct reflection of their core philosophies. Their different DNA really shines through here.
Yeah, absolutely. DC's gods among men. They tend to be challenged by these abstract philosophical evils. Take the Joker, perfect example. No consistent origin, no rational motive. He's just the embodiment of pure nihilistic anarchy, a force of chaos. His whole point seems to be proving that Batman's obsessive quest for order is just a bad joke. Lex Luthor isn't just a criminal mastermind. He represents malignant human pride, his xenophobia. He sees himself as humanity's real savior and just cannot stand the worship of this godlike alien. He's a dark reflection of human potential twisted by jealousy. Dark side, he's the ultimate tyrant, the personification of fascism, his whole quest for the anti-life equation, this cosmic formula for total mind control. It's a war against the very idea of free will, the pro of DC's villains, their iconic archetypal power, their forces of nature, philosophical concepts made flesh, almost myths themselves.
Okay, so DC's villains embody these huge abstract evils. But Marvel's villains feel a bit different, don't they? More grounded in human flaws.
They really are. Marvel's men becoming gods are usually challenged by other people, men and women, with understandable, if dangerously twisted, motivations. Dr. Doom is one of their greatest villains, right? But his goal isn't chaos, it's absolute order. He's this brilliant monarch, a scientist who genuinely believes only his iron fist can save humanity from itself. His villainy comes from this massive ego, this bitter rivalry with Reed Richards, but his desire for a peaceful world. In his mind, it's noble. Magneto, he's a freedom fighter whose methods are, undeniably terroristic. But his militant belief in mutant supremacy, it's born directly from the trauma of surviving the Holocaust. It's a never-again philosophy. He's trying to protect his people from suffering the same fate. Even a cosmic guy like Thanos, at least in his original comic version, he was driven by something recognizably human, but totally insane. This nihilistic, romantic obsession with courting the literal embodiment of death. The pro of Marvel's villains is this psychological depth, this tragic relatability. They're characters you can, on some level, sympathize with, even if you condemn their actions. That makes them incredibly compelling. They're reflections of humanity's dark side rather than just external cosmic forces.
Let's turn now from the characters themselves to the landmark storylines. The big ones that didn't just define their universes, but actually transformed the whole comic book industry. They approach these epic stories very differently too, and it really highlights those core philosophies again. It seems like DC often aims to reshape the medium itself or its own continuity, while Marvel uses big events more as crucibles, ways to test their characters' beliefs and psychology.
The mid-1980s. That was a massive turning point for comics, and it was really driven by two huge works from DC Comics that basically ushered in the dark age of comics. These weren't just stories, they were deconstructions, taking apart the very genre DC had built. Frank Miller's The Dark Knight returns in 1986. Seismic event. It completely recontextualized Batman, showed us this 55-year-old Bruce Wayne dragged out of retirement into this grim dystopian future. This Batman was brutal, obsessive, almost fascistic, totally different from the campy 60s TV show guy. It was a huge, critical, and commercial hit, and its dark, gritty tone just profoundly influenced every version of Batman that came after it in comics and film. And released right alongside it, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, 86-87. That went even further. It wasn't just deconstructing one character, it deconstructed the entire superhero archetype. Set in this realistic alternate history, it dug deep into the psychological flaws, the sexual issues, the societal impact of costume vigilantes. Its complex, multi-layered stories, sophisticated themes, it elevated comics to a new level of literary respectability. Won a Hugo Award, got on Time magazine's list of 100 greatest novels. Incredible. The pro for DC publishing these. Immense. It cemented their reputation as a place for mature, artistically ambitious, genre-defining work. Proved comics could be serious literature. The con, though, was their very influence. The success of Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns spawned this wave of grim and greedy copycats in the late 80s and 90s. These followers often just mimicked the darkness and the violence, but totally missed the smart satire and social commentary of the originals. It led to this decade where mainstream comics were just dominated by brooding, cynical anti-heroes and way too much violence. A golden age of deconstruction that unfortunately led to a period of less thoughtful imitation.
Wow. Sounds like they fundamentally changed how people even thought about superheroes. Okay, now let's compare two of the most iconic event comics, one from each side. The scale feels similar, but their purpose couldn't be more different, right?
You're absolutely right. DC's Crisis on Infinite Earths, 85-86. That was the first modern, line-wide crossover event. Writer Marv Wolfman basically conceived it because DC editorial needed to clean up 50 years of tangled, confusing, multiversal continuity. The story. The Anti-Monitor destroys the multiverse. Everything gets merged into a single, streamlined Earth. It set the template for all future event comics. Massive cast, universe-altering stakes, shocking deaths of major characters, Supergirl, Barry Allen, The Flash. Huge deals back then. The pro of a crisis, its incredible scale, huge commercial success. For the first time, it made the DC Universe feel like one single, cohesive thing. Gave new readers a clear jumping-on point. The con. As we talked about, it ultimately created almost as many continuity headaches as it solved. And it kind of locked DC into this destructive cycle of rebooting in every decade or so, which plagued them for years.
Okay, so Crisis was all about fixing the plumbing, managing continuity. How does Marvel's The Infinity Gauntlet compare? Was it designed to fix things, or was its goal totally different?
Marvel's The Infinity Gauntlet, 1991, by Jim Starlin and George Perez. Similar cosmic scale, yeah, but a fundamentally different purpose. The story. Thanos gets the Infinity Gems, snaps his fingers, wipes out half of all life. Huge stakes. But crucially, the story was not about fixing continuity. It was a deeply personal, psychological story. Focused on Thanos' insane love for Mistress Death and Adam Warlock's clever, philosophical maneuvering to beat him. The stakes were universal, sure, but the resolution felt intimate, psychological. The pro of that approach. It created a template for these character-driven cosmic epics. Stories that felt massive without needing a hard reboot of the whole universe. It produced iconic moments, villains, concept stuff Marvel mined for decades, most famously in the MCU movies, obviously. The con, maybe, from a certain viewpoint, lack of lasting consequences, the snap, the destruction, all reversed by the end. The whole thing took place over like a single day in universe. So the event felt maybe less impactful on the universe's long-term path compared to the permanent changes Crisis made. This comparison just perfectly shows their different event philosophies. DC uses events for continuity management. Marvel uses them as a crucible for character.
Okay, let's look at two more landmark stories that really illustrate this ideological split. One feels like this grand allegory, the other like a really personal political fight. It drills down into what kinds of stories they prioritize.
For DC, a great example is Kingdom Come, 1996, by Mark Waid and Alex Ross. This was an Elseworld story outside main continuity that served as this powerful critique of that whole grim and gritty era that DC itself had kind of helped start. It's set in the near future, depicts a world overrun by this new generation of violent, irresponsible anti-heroes who've forgotten what heroism even means. This forces DC's classic moral icons and older Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman out of retirement for one last battle. A battle for the soul of the genre, really. The pro of Kingdom Come. It's timeless, powerful allegory, and Alex Ross's just breathtaking, photorealistic painted art. It makes it one of the most beloved graphic novels ever. It's this profound meditation on what it means to be a hero, the con. Well, being out of continuity, its direct impact on the main DC universe was more philosophical than narrative. It didn't change the main timeline, but it definitely influenced how people thought about the characters.
And then there's Marvel's Civil War, a totally different kind of ideological clash, right? Much more grounded, political almost.
Yes, very different feel. Marvel's Civil War, 2006-07, by Mark Millar and Steve McNiven. This was a core in-continuity event, and it ripped the Marvel universe apart. The setup. A tragedy caused by some reckless young heroes leads the US government to pass a Superhuman Registration Act. Heroes have to unmask, work for the government. The story explored that really relevant real-world conflict between security and freedom, pitting Captain America's pro-liberty side against Iron Man's pro-registration side. A complex ideological battle, no easy answers. The pro of Civil War, its incredible relevance to the post-9/11 political climate, and its lasting devastating impact within the Marvel Universe. It shattered friendships, led to Captain America being assassinated, set the stage for years of stories that followed. It had real consequences for the characters people loved. The con, well, to make the plot work, it arguably did some lasting damage to Iron Man's character. Cast him in this kind of authoritarian role that took him years to recover from in the eyes of some fans. It really polarized the readership by forcing heroes into these opposing morally gray positions.
So what does this all mean for their presence now? In the 21st century, the battle between Marvel and DC. It's largely fought not just in comic shops, but more and more on screen. Movies, TV, their successes, their failures, there's like a clear case study in brand management, narrative strategy, and just the sheer difficulty of adapting decades of complex history for a mass audience. How did their different approaches play out in that biggest arena? Movies and TV.
Well, for a whole generation of fans growing up in the 90s, the definitive versions of these characters weren't always from the comics. They were from TV animation. And here, DC just hit it out of the park. Achieved a level of critical acclaim, narrative cohesion that's still seen as a benchmark for the entire genre. The DC Animated Universe, the DCEU, started with Batman, the animated series in '92. Monumental achievement in adaptation. Spearheaded by Bruce Timm, Paul Dini, it presented this mature, artistically sophisticated, narratively cohesive shared universe. Grew to include Superman, the animated series, Batman Beyond, the epic Justice League, and Justice League Unlimited. The DCAU is just lauded. That timeless Art Deco noir look, the complex characters, the respect for the source material, its influence was huge. It even fed back into the comics. Introduced characters like Harley Quinn, Renee Montoya, gave Mr. Freeze his definitive tragic backstory that's now totally canon. The pro for DC here, undeniable. The DCAU is a masterclass. Critical, popular success. Many people still think it's the best portrayal of these heroes ever. The con, though, its singular, unified vision set the bar so high that all subsequent DC adaptations, animated and live action, have kind of been measured against it, and often found wanting. It became almost too good for its own good, setting this impossible standard to live up to.
Right. And what was Marvel doing with animation in the 90s? Did they have that same kind of unified vision?
Marvel's animated stuff in the 90s, not as tightly structured, no unified vision like the DCAU, but commercially, it was a juggernaut. Huge cultural impact. Shows like X-Men, the animated series in '92, Spider-Man, the animated series in '94, ratings powerhouses. They were the main entry point into the Marvel Universe for millions of kids. The pro of Marvel's approach, then, its ambition. They adapted really long, complex comic storylines directly for TV. X-Men tackled the Dark Phoenix saga, Days of Future Past. Spider-Man wove these intricate season-long plots. These shows built a massive, dedicated fan base, a fan base that was totally primed and ready when the MCU launched over a decade later. The con, though, yeah, a lack of that unified narrative, that single artistic vision that defined the DCAU. The shows, while occasionally crossing over, mostly existed in separate continuities. You know, Earth 92131 for X-Men and Spidey, another Earth number for Iron Man and Fantastic Four, and the animation quality, the storytelling consistency, it varied more across the different series. There were huge successes individually, but didn't feel like one cohesive thing the way the DCAU did.
Okay, so if animated TV was kind of a proving ground, then the modern movie era is where the battle really came to a head, reflecting their comic book philosophies in the most public, high-stakes way. And the MCU just changed everything, didn't it?
Oh, completely changed the game.
Yeah.
The Marvel Cinematic Universe, the MCU. It succeeded because it basically translated Marvel's comic book strategy, cohesive, interconnected, character-first, saga-style storytelling directly to the big screen. It was very much a producer-driven thing, meticulously planned in phases under Kevin Feige. And crucially, it didn't start with their most famous characters, because Fox and Sony had the rights to X-Men and Spider-Man back then. No, it started with a perceived B-lister, Iron Man in 2008. That let the MCU build its world slowly, organically, earn the audience's trust before hitting them with the big team-up, the Avengers, in 2012. This patient, serialized approach. Perfect example of successful transmedia storytelling. Each movie works on its own, but it's also an episode in this bigger story. The pro of this strategy. Staggering, unprecedented success. Highest grossing film franchise ever. Made household names out of obscure characters like the Guardians of the Galaxy. Largely beloved for its coherent, satisfying long-form story. The cons. They've started popping up more recently. The perception of a Marvel formula films feeling repetitive, maybe underdeveloped villains sometimes. And right now, they're struggling a bit with audience fatigue as they try to manage the huge scale of this this multiverse saga. It's almost a victim of its own success, maybe?
And then there's the DCEU. Its journey has been, well, a lot rougher, hasn't it? More peaks and valleys. Mostly valleys.
Huh? Yeah, in stark contrast, the DC Extended Universe, the DCEU, it really struggled. It just couldn't seem to unite DC's separate, mythic, anthology-style properties into one single coherent movie narrative. It basically mirrored the exact continuity problems their comics have always had. The DCEU started with more of a director-driven approach, mostly Zack Snyder early on, and they tried to jumpstart a universe by immediately pitting their two biggest icons against each other in only the second film, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice in 2016. That rushed timeline, plus a really dark, divisive tone, and what felt like a lack of cohesive planning from the studio. It led to a franchise that was mostly critically panned, and commercially, it really underperformed compared to the MCU, the pro of the DCEU's initial strategy. It did allow for some unique, bold visual styles. More tonally ambitious films sometimes, like the first Wonder Woman in 2017, which was great, The Con, pretty much everything else, a track record of disappointment, confused branding, constant studio interference that just alienated filmmakers and audiences alike, and all that failure led to where we are now, a complete reboot. The new DC universe, the DCU, run by James Gunn and Peter Safran, and they're explicitly aiming to copy the MCU's successful, centrally planned model. The numbers tell the story, right? MCU, 33 films, nearly $30 billion worldwide, 83% average on Rotten Tomatoes. DCEU, 16 films, $7.1 billion, 55% average. It's just a stark, undeniable difference in cinematic success.
It feels like their journeys in live-action TV have followed kind of similar, different paths, too. Both tried things, but with different levels of success and, crucially, integration with the movies.
They definitely have. On live-action TV, DC actually found success much earlier than Marvel, but again, with that fragmented approach. The Arrowverse, starting with Arrow on the CW back in 2012. That grew into this sprawling, interconnected universe of shows. The Flash, Supergirl, Legends of Tomorrow, more. The pro of the Arrowverse. It built this incredibly loyal fan base. It managed to pull off ambitious, comic-booky crossover events on a TV budget, successfully brought a huge range of DC characters to life, created a real community feel. The con, though, it existed completely separate from the DCEU movies. Total brand confusion. And it meant those popular, well-established TV versions of characters like The Flash couldn't show up on the big screen. You couldn't have Grant Gustin's Flash meet Ben Affleck's Batman, which drove fans nuts.
Right, and Marvel's TV journey was quite different, evolving over time with a big shift recently.
Indeed. Marvel's first tries at modern live-action TV were also disconnected. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was nominally tied to the MCU, but felt separate. Then you had the much more acclaimed Netflix shows, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, etc., existing in this grittier, darker, ambiguous corner of the universe. The pro there, the high quality of those Netflix shows, praised for their mature tone and deep character work. The con, their connection to the wider MCU felt really tenuous, like optional viewing, not essential. So Marvel course-corrected, folded TV production directly under Marvel Studios for the Disney Plus era. Now shows like WandaVision, Loki, Ms. Marvel. They are integral, must-watch chapters of the main MCU story, which is a pro for narrative cohesion, but a potential con for casual viewers, right? The barrier to entry to keep up with the whole story is much higher now. If you skip a show, you might be totally lost in the next movie.
Okay, so as we look ahead to the future, and it's really interesting, we're seeing this fascinating convergence in strategy. Marvel seems focused on expanding, maintaining its established empire. Well, DC is going through this fundamental rebuild, explicitly trying to copy its rivals' model. It feels like they're trading playbooks, almost.
That's a perfect way to describe it. Yeah. In comics, Marvel's 2025 plans, still focused on big, status quo-shaking event stories. This upcoming One World Under Doom event, Doom takes over the world, heroes fight back, universe-wide consequences promised. At the same time, the X-Men line is moving into a whole new era, the Age of Revelation, after wrapping up the Krakoan Age, that whole mutant nation idea. This new direction focuses on Doug Ramsey as Apocalypse's heir, forging a new world order for mutants, a major evolution for Marvel's most popular franchise, the pro for Marvel's comic strategy, that deep well of history they can draw on, their proven ability to generate buzz with these huge events, the con, that constant risk of narrative bloat, event fatigue. Readers get tired of hearing the universe has changed forever every single year. It gets hard to believe the stakes are real when things reset so often.
And what about the MCU's long game? Are they still pushing forward with the multiverse saga, aiming for another big climax?
Absolutely. Kevin Feige and Marvel Studios are steering the MCU towards the conclusion of the multiverse saga, Upcoming movies like Captain America, Brave New World, Thunderbolts, they're building towards this massive two-part finale, Avengers, Doomsday and Avengers, Secret Wars. Beyond that, Feige has talked about a patient, long-term strategy for bringing in newly acquired characters, especially the X-Men, mentioned like a 10-year plan, suggesting a deliberate, slow burn, trying to avoid the mistakes of rushing big characters onto the screen too fast. The pro of this movie strategy, the trust Marvel has built with its audience, their proven track record of pulling off long-form storytelling. The con, the huge challenge of managing this increasingly complex multiverse and keeping audiences engaged through what some perceive as a period of creative inconsistency or franchise fatigue. It's a real tightrope walk for them now.
Okay, so what does this all mean for DC? It sounds like they're making this incredibly ambitious play, a truly unified universe, learning directly from Marvel's playbook.
Indeed. Under James Gunn and Peter Safran, DC Studios is explicitly ditching the fragmented, chaotic past, aiming for one single, unified narrative continuity across everything: film, TV, animation, video games. This new DC universe, the DCEU, officially kicks off with Gunn's own movie, Superman, in July 2025. The stated strategy: build the universe methodically, introduce characters in their own projects before rushing into a big team-up. A direct lesson learned from the DCU's failures. The initial slate for Chapter 1, Gods and Monsters. It shows they're trying to balance big icons with more obscure characters. So you've got Superman, a new Batman movie called The Brave and the Bold, but also projects like Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, a horror-style Swamp Thing, the gritty team-up The Authority. This directly mirrors Marvel's successful strategy of elevating lesser-known characters, building trust. The pro for the new DCU, huge opportunity, clean slate. Guided by a respected, fan-trusted leader in James Gunn, a chance to finally build the cohesive, compelling live-action universe these iconic characters deserve. The con, immense pressure to succeed. And the massive challenge of winning back a general audience that's been alienated, confused by years of inconsistency, cancellations, competing Batman and Superman. It's a huge uphill battle, but the potential is incredible.
It's just fascinating. For decades, Marvel and DC were defined by these wildly different ways of building worlds. Now, here in the 2020s, they're converging on an almost identical multimedia strategy. Centrally planned, multi-platform, interconnected universe overseen by one creative lead. Those historical differences that define them. They're now less about what they're trying to do and more about where they are in the process. Marvel's in the expand and maintain phase of its empire. DC is in the rebuild from the ground up phase. It really feels like the future of their legendary rivalry will be defined, maybe for the first time ever, not by different philosophies, but by direct competition using the exact same strategic playbook.
Yeah, and when you synthesize this whole comparison, you get a really clear picture of each publisher's core strengths and weaknesses, all rooted in their unique histories, their foundational philosophies. For DC Comics, the pros are undeniable, mythic archetypes. They own arguably the most recognizable, culturally powerful superheroes. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman are modern myths, literary prestige. Their structure allowed for groundbreaking, genre-defining work like Watchmen, Sandman, earning comics real respect, and animated excellence. The DCEU is just the gold standard for adaptation. The cons for DC: convoluted continuity. Their main method, the multiverse and reboots, has often led to narratives that are just inaccessible, confusing for anyone not already deep in the lore. And that inconsistent live-action strategy. For decades, their movies and shows suffered from mismanagement, no clear vision, studio meddling, resulting in a really inconsistent footprint compared to Marvel, and for Marvel Comics, the pros. Relatable characters in a cohesive universe. Their biggest strength is that world of flawed, complex, grounded characters in one interconnected reality. Fosters deep reader investment. Unprecedented multimedia success. The MCU is a cultural, commercial behemoth, a masterclass in synergistic storytelling that reshaped Hollywood, and consistent brand identity. From comics to films, Marvel usually has a more consistent tone, making their stuff readily identifiable, accessible to the masses. The cons for Marvel: the flaws of the timescale. Keeping characters young creates those logical holes, chronological knots that kind of undermine the realism they aim for. The Marvel formula: their own success led to accusations of creative repetition, especially in origin stories and big third-act fights. And a history of instability. That journey through bankruptcy and ownership changes. It shaped a more commercially focused, maybe sometimes creatively risk-averse, corporate culture.
Ultimately, this decades-long rivalry between Marvel and DC, born from those fundamentally different starting points, it's been the main engine driving innovation in the whole superhero genre. They really are two sides of the same coin, aren't they? The originator and the revolutionary. The myth makers and the humanists. In competing with each other, they've pushed the boundaries of the medium, they've learned from each other's wins and losses, and in doing so, they've crafted the most enduring, influential mythologies of our modern age. As we've really dug into today, the core takeaway from this deep dive is just how much that initial split, gods among men versus men becoming gods, has shaped everything. Their characters, their corporate moves, their movies, their TV shows. So the next time you encounter a hero from either universe, whether it's on the page or on the screen, think about these layers. You'll see that core DNA shining through, informing every punch, every speech, every world-saving decision.
And that really raises an important question as we wrap up. As Marvel and DC seem to be converging on these almost identical multi-platform strategies, will those deeply ingrained philosophical differences, that core DNA, eventually just blur beyond recognition? Or even though they're using the same strategic playbook now, will their unique origins, their fundamental ways of looking at heroism and storytelling, always ensure a distinct experience? Will it push them to new heights in this unified creative arms race? What does it mean for the future of modern mythology when the originator and the revolutionary start looking so much like each other? It makes you think, doesn't it?